In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Lagos, there lived a young girl named Kemi. With thick, dark braids that cascaded down her back and a warm, innocent smile, she was the picture of youthful optimism. But beneath that smile was a heart burdened by the weight of abandonment, a feeling she had carried with her for as long as she could remember. Her parents, Mama Bola and Papa Ade, were once loving and attentive. They had dreams for Kemi, dreams of her becoming a doctor, a teacher, or anything that would elevate their family's status. But as the years passed, their love began to fade. They grew consumed by their own personal struggles, Mama Bola with her side businesses and Papa Ade with his increasing desire for wealth. It wasn't long before they started to forget about the one thing that truly needed their attention, Kemi. One fateful evening, after a heated argument that Kemi overheard from her bedroom, her parents made a decision that would change everything. They packed their bags and left. Mama Bola had announced that they were taking a trip to the village, leaving Kemi in the care of a family friend, who was really just a teacher. "Don't worry, my dear. We'll be back soon," Mama Bola had said with a strained smile, but Kemi knew better. It wasn't the first time they'd promised to return. That was 2 weeks ago. Mr. Tund, Kemi's schoolteacher, had been tasked with looking after her during their absence. He was a tall, quiet man with a gentle demeanor. He had always been kind to Kemi, often giving her extra lessons when she struggled with her studies. Yet, there was something unsettling about the way he looked at her now. The lines of kindness were replaced by something darker, something Kemi couldn't yet understand. For the first few days after her parents left, everything seemed normal. Mr. Tund brought her food, helped with her homework, and kept her company. But slowly, the days began to blur together. Mr. Tund grew more and more distant, his kindness replaced by an uncomfortable silence that hung heavily in the air. Kemi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, after another long day of waiting for her parents to come home, Kemi ventured into the kitchen to find Mr. Tund sitting at the table, staring into the distance with a look of intense concentration. The radio played quietly in the background, but the room felt cold. Kemi shivered slightly, unsure of how to approach him. "Mr. Tund," she asked softly, "when are my parents coming back?" He didn't immediately respond. When he finally turned to look at her, his eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth she had once seen in them. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Kemi," he said in a voice that was too quiet, too controlled, "your parents aren't coming back. Not any time soon. And you need to understand something. You are mine now." The words hung in the air, more like a command than a statement. Kemi froze, a chill running down her spine. She blinked, trying to process what he had just said. Was it a joke? Or was he serious? "Mr. Tund, I don't understand," Kemi stammered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" Mr. Tund's lips curled into a grim smile, but there was no humor in it. "What I mean, Kemi, is that your parents left you here for a reason. They don't care about you. I care about you. And now you will stay with me." Kemi's heart pounded in her chest. This was no longer about being alone or waiting for her parents to come home. This was something else entirely, something far darker than she could have imagined. Fear bubbled up inside her, but she held it down, forcing herself to think. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on his. "I want to go home," she whispered, though deep down she knew she had no real home to go to. Mr. Tund's expression softened, but it was an unsettling softness, one that only made Kemi feel more trapped. "This is your home now, Kemi," he said softly. "You'll see. You'll understand. But for now, we need to be quiet. We need to keep everything between us, just like it has been." Kemi turned and ran out of the room, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know where to go, what to do, or who to trust. The only thing she knew was that she couldn't stay in that house with Mr. Tund, not after what he had said. That night, Kemi lay awake in her bed, the sheets twisted around her as she stared at the ceiling. The sounds of the house were amplified in the silence, each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the windows, adding to the growing sense of unease that filled her every thought. Her mind raced with questions. Why had her parents left? Where had they gone? And most importantly, why had Mr. Tun's behavior changed so suddenly? The once kind teacher who had helped her with her studies now seemed like a stranger, someone she couldn't trust. The next morning, Kemi decided she had to act. She couldn't wait for her parents to return, and she couldn't trust Mr. Tund. She needed to find a way to escape. But as she prepared to leave the house that day, she realized something that sent a wave of dread through her body. Mr. Tund had locked the door. She couldn't leave. Desperation set in. Was she truly trapped here, in a house with someone she once considered a friend but who now seemed like a threat? This is just the opening of your story. Let me know if you want me to continue, and I will keep developing it with more twists and shocking moments, focusing on African characters and their emotional journey. Kemi stared at the locked door, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorknob. Her thoughts raced with panic. Mr. Tund had locked her in. She could feel the weight of the air around her, heavy, suffocating, and thick with unspoken threats. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sound, any hint that Mr. Tund was nearby. The silence that followed was eerie, and Kemi felt as if the walls of the house were closing in on her. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt like a prison. The smell of stale air and the coldness that lingered in the corners made her shiver. She turned away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a place where everything had changed, and she was no longer a child living her normal life. She was trapped. She could still hear the faint hum of the radio from the kitchen, where Mr. Tund had been sitting earlier, staring at her with that unsettling look in his eyes. It was as if he had some kind of hold over her, something that made him believe he could control her life now. Kemi didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she felt it. The fear gnawed at her insides, but she pushed it aside, determined to find a way out. The window! Her mind raced as she remembered the small window above her bed, one that she had once climbed out of to play in the yard. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance she had. Kemi quickly moved to the window, pulling at the curtain and tugging at the latch. It was stuck. Her breath hitched as she struggled with it, trying to force it open. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the window gave way with a creak, and she slipped her body through, her feet landing on the small ledge outside. Her heart was in her throat as she balanced precariously, afraid of falling. The ground was about 10 feet below, but the rush of freedom called to her, and with one final glance at the house she had been locked inside, she jumped. The hard earth beneath her feet was a shock, but she didn't hesitate. She took off running, faster than she had ever run in her life. She had no destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to escape. But as she ran through the dusty streets, Kemi quickly realized that she was alone in a world she didn't understand. Her parents were gone. Her teacher had turned into someone she couldn't trust. She had no family, no friends, just the harsh reality that no one would come to help her. Her feet ached, and the sweat on her brow stung in the hot sun, but she kept running. She ran past her school, past the market, past the familiar faces that had once greeted her with smiles. But now, those faces barely looked up. The city had changed too. Or maybe it was just Kemi who had changed. Everything felt different now. The world she had once known was no longer the same. By the time Kemi stopped to catch her breath, her legs were trembling and her head was spinning. She leaned against a crumbling wall, trying to steady herself. Where could she go? Her mind was blank as the weight of the situation crashed down on her once again. Mr. Tund could be anywhere, and the thought of returning to him, back to that house, was enough to make her stomach churn. Just then, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. Kemi turned quickly, her heart racing. She could feel her chest tighten, and before she could react, a voice called out to her. "Kemi, wait." It was Duro, a boy from her class. He had always been kind to her, a bit older than her, but they had shared many laughs at school. He stopped in front of her, his face filled with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but full of worry. "Why are you out here alone?" Kemi hesitated. Could she trust him? She wanted to believe she could, but everything had been so turned upside down. Could she risk telling him the truth? Could she trust anyone after what had happened with Mr. Tund? Kemi's voice faltered. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see Mr. Tund's face lurking in the shadows. But there was no one there. She took a deep breath. "I don't know what to do. Mr. Tund, he locked me in. He said my parents aren't coming back." Duro's eyes widened in shock. "Locked you in," he repeated, clearly unsure if he had heard her right. "What are you talking about? What do you mean?" Kemi swallowed hard. "My parents, they went away, and they left me with him. But now, I don't know. I can't go back. He said things I don't understand." Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud made it more real. Duro looked at her for a long moment, his expression hardening. "You can't go back there," he said firmly. "We need to tell someone. This isn't right. Something is happening, and it's not safe." "But who can we tell?" Kemi asked, her voice tinged with fear. "What if no one believes me?" "We'll make them believe," Duro said. "I'll help you, Kemi. We'll go to the police. We'll tell them everything." Kemi felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a way out of this after all. Maybe she didn't have to face Mr. Tund alone. But as they began to walk toward the police station, Kemi couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the world around her grew even more unfamiliar. Just as they turned the corner, Kemi heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding once again. She turned slowly, and there he was, Mr. Tund. He was standing in the middle of the street, watching her with that same cold expression, his hands tucked into his pockets. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Duro, then slowly shifted back to Kemi. "You're not going anywhere," he said quietly, his voice smooth and chilling. "You belong with me, Kemi. You always will." Kemi's breath caught in her throat, and she knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning of something far darker. This part continues to build suspense, as Kemi now finds herself in an even more dangerous situation, with Mr. Tund's presence looming over her. If you'd like, I can continue the story further or adjust any parts. Let me know how you'd like it to proceed. The world around Kemi seemed to freeze in that moment. The air thickened, and her pulse hammered in her ears as Mr. Tund's cold gaze fixed on her, the tension between them suffocating. Her heart raced, but she couldn't move. It felt as though her body was locked in place, trapped under the weight of his stare. Duro, standing beside her, didn't move either, but his stance had shifted. He placed himself between Kemi and Mr. Tund, a silent act of protection. His expression was one of disbelief, but there was no mistaking the edge of anger that flared in his eyes. "Mr. Tund," Duro spoke, his voice steady but firm, "you need to stay away from her. She's not going back with you." Mr. Tund's lips twitched into a dark smile. "And who do you think you are, Duro? Kemi belongs with me now. She has no one else." He stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his voice low and menacing. "She's mine." Kemi's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time she felt the full weight of her fear. Mr. Tund was no longer the teacher she had known. This man in front of her was something else entirely. He had crossed a line that she could never unsee, never forget. No, Kemi's voice was barely a whisper, but it felt as though she had shouted it to the heavens. "I don't belong to you." She took a step back, but her legs were trembling. She wanted to run, but the thought of Mr. Tund's cold hands gripping her again kept her rooted to the spot. She glanced around frantically for an escape, but the street seemed emptier than ever, the world closing in on her. Where were the people? Why didn't anyone else seem to notice what was happening? Duro, noticing her hesitation, took a step toward Mr. Tund. "I'm not going to let you hurt her," he said, his voice calm but filled with a quiet fury. "You don't scare me. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through me first." Mr. Tund's smile faltered for a moment, and Kemi saw the flicker of something in his eyes, something dangerous. He took another step closer to Duro, his face darkening. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into, boy. This isn't your fight." But Duro wasn't backing down. Kemi could feel the energy in the air shift, and for the first time since she had run away, she felt a spark of hope flicker inside her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone after all. "You're not taking her anywhere," Duro repeated, his jaw clenched. "You'll regret it if you try." The street seemed to hold its breath as the tension grew thicker. Mr. Tund and Duro stood facing each other, neither one willing to back down. Kemi could feel the electricity in the air, the impending conflict, and her mind raced with possibilities. She needed to do something. She couldn't just stand here, hoping things would work themselves out. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She had no idea who she could call, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't leave this moment to chance. She needed help. Desperately. As she unlocked the phone, her fingers fumbled with the screen. Her eyes darted back and forth between Duro and Mr. Tund. The sense of urgency gripped her, but her hands were shaking so much that she struggled to dial. Then, as if guided by instinct, she pressed the number she knew by heart, her aunt, Ngozi, who lived just outside of Lagos. The phone rang once, twice, and then it clicked. Kemi's voice was shaky but desperate when her aunt picked up. "Aunt Ngozi," she gasped, "please, it's Mr. Tund. He's here. He won't let me go. He's not the same man he was before. I need you to come. Please." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Kemi could hear her aunt's voice change, become sharper, more urgent. "Stay where you are, Kemi," Aunt Ngozi said, her voice steady. "I'm coming for you. Don't trust him. Do not go back with him, no matter what. Understand?" Kemi swallowed hard, nodding even though her aunt couldn't see her. "I understand." The call ended with a sharp click, and Kemi held the phone tightly, the weight of her aunt's words grounding her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had a plan. Her aunt was coming, and Kemi wasn't alone. But just as the relief began to settle in, Mr. Tund moved. In an instant, he lunged forward, grabbing Duro by the collar and shoving him back. Duro stumbled, falling to the ground, but he quickly recovered, his eyes blazing with fury. "Stay out of this, Duro," Mr. Tund hissed, his grip tightening. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Kemi's heart raced. She knew she had to act quickly, or Duro would get hurt. She could see the raw strength in Mr. Tund's hands, but she also saw something else, a weakness. He was rattled. He was desperate. And Kemi wasn't going to let him take control of her life any longer. With a quick movement, she grabbed a nearby rock from the street, her fingers tight around it. Without thinking, she hurled it at Mr. Tund's head. The rock hit him square on the temple. Mr. Tund staggered back, letting go of Duro, his hand flying to his head in a daze. He glared at Kemi, rage boiling in his eyes. "You," he started, but Kemi didn't wait for him to finish. She grabbed Duro's hand and pulled him to his feet. "Run," she whispered, barely able to contain her fear. "We need to get out of here. He's coming after us." They turned and bolted down the street, their feet pounding on the pavement as the sound of Mr. Tund's enraged voice echoed behind them. Kemi's breath came in quick gasps as they rounded corners, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. They ran for what felt like hours, but Kemi couldn't stop. She couldn't let Mr. Tund catch up with them. She didn't know how far Aunt Ngozi was, but she had to believe she was coming. She had to. Finally, They reached a narrow alley, and Kemi pulled Duro behind a wall, panting. "We need to hide," she said between breaths. Duro nodded, looking just as exhausted. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. They had to keep moving, keep running, because Mr. Tund was still out there, and he wasn't about to let them go. This chapter continues the tension, adding more action and a sense of urgency. Kemi is desperate to escape, and with Duro's help, she takes action to survive. The arrival of her aunt seems to offer a potential resolution, but the danger is far from over. If you'd like, I can continue with more twists or focus on specific character developments. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. Kemi and Duro hid in the narrow alley, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they leaned against the wall, trying to catch their bearings. The sounds of Mr. Tund's footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, but Kemi couldn't afford to stop and listen. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, and she knew they had to keep moving. Her mind raced as she clutched Duro's hand tightly. "Where is Aunt Ngozi?" Kemi muttered to herself, the fear creeping back in. Her aunt had promised to come, but there was no sign of her yet. She couldn't wait much longer. She needed to find a way to put an end to this. "We'll be okay," Duro said, his voice reassuring but tense. "She's coming, Kemi. Just hold on." Kemi nodded, but doubt lingered in her chest. Mr. Tund was relentless, and even though she had managed to escape for now, she couldn't shake the feeling that he would come after her with everything he had. As they crouched in the alley, Kemi's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle's engine approaching. Her heart leapt in her chest as she saw headlights sweep across the street. She turned to Duro, her eyes wide. "It's Aunt Ngozi. She's here." Without hesitation, they rushed out from their hiding spot, sprinting toward the car. The headlights grew brighter, and as the vehicle slowed to a stop, Kemi's breath caught in her throat. Her aunt, Ngozi, stepped out of the car, her expression steely and determined. She was a woman of few words, but there was no mistaking the resolve in her eyes. "Kemi." "Duro." Aunt Ngozi called, her voice filled with authority. She quickly opened the car door for them, her eyes scanning the street warily. "Get in now. It's not safe here." Kemi didn't need to be told twice. She practically threw herself into the back seat, and Duro followed quickly behind her. Aunt Ngozi slammed the door shut with a finality that made Kemi feel as though they were escaping a nightmare. The engine roared to life, and the car sped off down the street. As they drove further away from the heart of the city, Kemi glanced out the window, half expecting to see Mr. Tund appear behind them. But the streets were empty, and the danger seemed to be fading with every mile. I can't believe it's over," Kemi whispered, her voice shaky. Aunt Ngozi glanced at her in the rear-view mirror. "It's not over yet, Kemi. Not completely. We need to go somewhere safe, somewhere that man can't find us." Kemi nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle over her. She had barely escaped the grip of Mr. Tund, and yet the relief she felt was mixed with anxiety. Would he come looking for her? Would he try to make good on his threats? "I'm so sorry this happened to you, Kemi," Aunt Ngozi said softly, her eyes softening as she glanced back at her niece. "But you're safe now, and I won't let anyone hurt you. I promise." Kemi's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and exhaustion overwhelming her. The fear of Mr. Tund still loomed over her, but for the first time in weeks she felt like she could breathe again. She could feel the weight of her parents' abandonment lift, replaced by the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone. Aunt Ngozi had come for her, and that meant everything. As they reached Aunt Ngozi's home on the outskirts of Lagos, Kemi felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The house was modest, tucked away from the chaos of the city. It was a place of safety, a sanctuary where she could begin to rebuild her life. Aunt Ngozi took Kemi into her arms as they arrived, the warmth of her embrace a stark contrast to the cold fear that had gripped Kemi for so long. "You're home now, Kemi," she said gently. "You're going to be okay." But Kemi wasn't so sure. She could still hear Mr. Tun's voice in her mind, feel his eyes on her as though he were still lurking in the shadows. The man who had once been her teacher, her protector, was now the source of her nightmares. The next few days passed in a blur. Aunt Ngozi kept Kemi close, shielding her from the outside world and making sure she was safe. They contacted the authorities, and the police began an investigation into Mr. Tun's activities, though Kemi wasn't sure how far it would go. She knew that someone like him could slip through the cracks if they weren't careful. But for now, all she could do was hold on to the hope that justice would prevail. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of Aunt Ngozi's home, Kemi asked the question that had been gnawing at her mind since the day her parents had left. "Aunt Ngozi, why did Mama Bola and Papa Ade leave me? Why did they abandon me like that?" Aunt Ngozi's expression softened, and for a moment Kemi saw the flicker of sadness in her eyes. "Kemi, your parents made some very bad choices. They were chasing after things that didn't matter. Money, status. They were blind to what really mattered. But you're not like them. You've always been strong, and you always will be. You'll find your way, I promise." Kemi felt tears sting at the corners of her eyes, but this time they weren't just tears of fear or anger. They were tears of understanding. She had been left alone, but she wasn't alone anymore. She had Aunt Ngozi, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could start over. It wouldn't be easy. The scars of her past would remain, and the darkness of Mr. Tun's betrayal would stay with her. But as Kemi looked out the window at the setting sun, she knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than ever before. And no matter what came next, she would face it head-on. As the days went by, the investigation into Mr. Tund revealed that he had been involved in a string of troubling activities. His obsession with Kemi was just the tip of the iceberg. He was arrested, and the authorities began to unravel the full extent of his manipulation. It was a bitter victory, but it was one that brought Kemi a sense of closure. And so, in the quiet safety of Aunt Ngozi's home, Kemi began to rebuild. With every passing day, the fear that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by hope, a hope that, despite everything, she would one day be able to trust again. The story emphasizes how crucial it is to recognize when a situation becomes dangerous, even if it involves people you once trusted. Kemi's courage to escape and seek help when Mr. Tun's behavior became alarming highlights the importance of listening to your instincts and prioritizing personal safety.